So I'm also looking at literature, but from the perspective of a translator. So it is a bit different, but hopefully there'll be some overlap and I won't be the odd one out in the session. In the past season of the ABC comedy drama Rake, Cleaver Green's ex-wife Wendy reveals her lifelong dream to move to Sardinia and open an English language bookshop. A dream that almost looks like coming true until it is foiled by circumstances outside her control. Basically her ex-husband. There is no indication that Wendy has any first-hand experience of Italy, much less of its second largest island, and one suspects hers is a dream grounded not in reality but in hopeful romanticism. Indeed, the more practically minded, even just those with a greater familiarity with Italy and Italian culture, can't help but wonder, does Wendy know the Italian market? Who does she think will buy all these English language books from her? And above all, how will she cope with the country's notorious bureaucracy for small business owners? For me, there are even more questions. Will she stock copies of my translations of the Sardinian novelist Milena Arbus? Oh, that's Wendy. That's my translations. Will they sell well among the Anglophone expats living in or visiting, presumably, Sardinia? Will these readers notice or care that this is an Australian bookseller peddling a translation by an Australian? This got me wondering what it might mean to be an Australian translator or to be translating primarily for an Australian audience, which is my position. So my talk today is about the literary translator as transcultural mediator and how the act of translation allows stories to circulate internationally. As a translator of contemporary Italian writing into English, mostly for Australian publishers so far, I want to start off by taking a reflective practice approach to my production. Reflective practice is a combination of an analytical process of reflection, in this case reflection on the translation process, coupled with the reflexivity of self-analysis. So it involves looking at my own motivations, processes, and decisions as a translator. My subject position affects the way I approach my work. For starters, my day job is as an academic in an Italian studies program, which means I don't have to go out actively looking for translation jobs. When they come my way, I like to ensure that they resonate in some way with my own background and interests, and values, you might say. For example, Salvatore Striano's memoir of his term in Rebibbia maximum security prison, after several years as a gang member and drug dealer in Naples' Quartieri Spagnoli, included some social commentary that I felt was important, even though the author's background could not have been more different from my own. In the book, Striano relates how his at first reluctant membership of a prison drama group led to a passion for literature, especially Eduardo and Shakespeare, which in turn gave him the tools to come to terms with his past and envision for himself a different future. My research interest in Italian crime fiction and my convictions about the value of literature meant that I especially liked the novel's message about the transformative power of reading and its comments about the social origins of crime, particularly in economically deprived areas of southern Italy. These were features of the book I could then try to give special emphasis to in my translation. Nicola La Gioia's novel, Riportando tutto a casa, appealed to me for its highly literary style, its irony and humour, topics that had been the focus of my PhD research, and its exploration of themes like privilege, consumerism, addiction, and the transformation Italy underwent in the 1980s. Again, I sought to ensure these elements were prominent and effective in the translation. More recently, I was excited to embark on the translation of a kind of domestic thriller, which is so far the best way I've thought of, been able to think of to describe it, Massimo Donati's Giochi Cattivi. Again, my background in the study of crime fiction means I have an interest in this kind of narrative construction, although it's not actually a crime novel, but there's a very suspenseful unfolding of the drama. And in the book's unusual mix of voices was an appealing translation challenge for me. So those are just a couple of examples of what I think I bring to my reading and what I try to bring forth in the books I translate. But equally important is reflection on what my readers bring to the experience and hope to get out of it. What kind of relationship might they have to Italy, or at least to some notion of Italy? Oh, I don't know why that's there, sorry. Let's go back. What kind of relationship might they have to Italy, or at least to some notion of Italy? What kind of associations? Returning for a moment to Rake, Wendy first expresses her desire to move to a cottage in Sardinia after the death of a friend has made her reflect on her own mortality. Cleaver's response to this is characteristic of his unique capacity to stare down the barrel of Australia's most insidious and illogical trends and enthusiasms, whether linguistic or social. He asks, "What is it about death that makes everyone want to move to a cottage in Italy?" He goes on, I wish I knew how to put videos in and we had the time, because he, of course, delivers it better than me, but he continues, "When people die in Italy, do you reckon they're all wanting to pull up stumps and move to Balmain?" While undoubtedly insensitive and a spoil sport, Cleaver makes a very perceptive observation. Our perceptions of a romanticised or exoticised other can at times have more to do with what we seek than with what we might actually find. And his comment raises the possibility that Wendy's sense of the curative powers of Italy/Sardinia might be wishful thinking. The same tension underlies our consumption of translations. Most Australians have a degree of familiarity with Italian culture that will colour their reading experience. Italian culture might be quite a presence in the Australian dictionary, but as a translator, and for that matter as an educator, I feel it's important to bear in mind the possibility that this might lead to a deceptive sense of confidence or familiarity. Large-scale migration from Italy to Australia has a history of more than half a century now, and success stories of integration and positive contributions to the wider community mean that it can be easy for Australians, and this is both Italian Australians and other Australians, to unquestioningly assume a deeper understanding of the nuances of Italian culture than is in fact warranted. When I translate, I try to strike a balance between exploiting the background knowledge, even preconceptions of my readers, and ensuring my translation has the potential to bring in a little newness, sharpening somewhat any previously blurred or broad brush images of the Italian other. In other words, there are ways to both exploit stereotypes and preconceptions if they can be useful to the reading experience, and to short-circuit them if they risk causing interference. And I've got a couple of examples. So in La Tempesta di Sassao, or Set Me Free as it is in English, the sort of gang-based criminal activity that led to the author's incarceration is likely to be quite familiar to readers of the translation. Among the stereotypes of Italy and Anglophone countries is unfortunately the association between southern Italy and organised crime. An Anglophone audience could be expected through film and television series like The Godfather series, The Sopranos, the Underbelly franchise here in Australia, recently the Netflix-produced Suburra, Blood on Rome, to know of underworld codes of loyalty and of silence, for example. Criminality is unquestionably an important point of Striano's background. So this audience familiarity is a useful tool, and my translation bears traces of this in its language. Certain subcultural values like vendetta or vendetta, omertà and pentito are a powerful presence even in the translation, as the inmates, mostly ex-mafiosi and camorristi, negotiate among themselves within the theatre group as they put on these performances. What sets Striano's book apart from a lot of depictions of mafia in popular culture is its insight into what can happen to those lucky or perhaps, well, I wasn't sure whether to say unlucky or lucky, enough to get caught. Rather than focusing on doing the crimes, whether glamorous or gritty in their depiction, Striano's story focuses instead on doing the time. Many years of it, so many that he goes on a veritable journey through various stages of grief, addiction, guilt, loneliness, atonement and fulfilment. In addition to its uplifting quality, apparent corroboration perhaps of the universally curative properties of literature and particularly of Shakespeare, Striano's tale allows readers to draw on what they know or what they think they know about organised crime, while at the same time asking them to view it as a multifactorial social problem with multiple victims. In emphasising the importance of community building in prisoner rehabilitation, the author exposes the conflicted and often damaging set of cultural values that had become so ingrained in him and his fellow prisoners from a young age. To move to other kinds of examples, dialect has featured in almost all of the works I've translated. Not ever so far as a constant or even central presence, but as an element I've nevertheless felt it important to maintain in translation, as an indicator of internal diversity within Italy. Australians are often aware of the variety that exists among dialects, thanks in part to the phenomenon of Italian migrants and their descendants, who might know an Italian dialect but not necessarily standard Italian, for a whole host of reasons that I don't need to rehash with today's audience. So the appearance of some dialect, or references even just to a dialect, in a novel will fit in with that background knowledge, while at the same time hopefully adding nuance to the depiction of the setting for Australian readers. In Argus's Sardinian novels, for example, dialect tends to be an indicator of provincialism and close-mindedness. In her books, it's associated with the villages of the interior as distinct from Cagliari. In those novels by La Gioia and Donati, dialect is bundled up with social class, as the highly privileged young protagonists perceive their own inability to understand dialect as constituting an ill-defined gap that causes them unease and occasions distrust in others. In Striano's prison memoir, dialect is a source of cultural identity and pride. The prisoners stage Eduardo de Filippo's translation of The Tempest into 17th century Neapolitan. But it's also a sign of difference among the inmates, whose regional affiliations sometimes lead to rivalry, especially on the soccer pitch. These are markers of diversity that even monolingual Australian readers can pick up on, with a little help from their translator. The reason this is important to me is that I like the idea that my translations might contribute to readers gaining a sense of the multiple Italys that exist within one nation. The stories I have translated do not unfold under the Tuscan sun, or in any other location that is the destination of mass tourism from Australia. Instead, we have Cagliari, Bari, Trentino, Rebibbia. Each of these places represents, albeit in very different ways, somehow local or provincial, or even perhaps you could say in some cases subjugated realities with respect to Italy's power bases. Of course, what readers actually make of the translations they read is harder to pin down. It's likely that their responses are shaped only partly by a book's content and by my translation strategies, especially since translators of contemporary fiction into English are rarely afforded an introduction or a translator's note through which to guide the reading in any way. Reviews can provide some insight into reader responses, even though, of course, reviewers are specific kinds of readers, or perhaps not always typical readers. I don't have a great number of reviews to draw on, which possibly is related also to the marketing of translation. I don't know, this is not my purview. So I don't have a great number of reviews to draw on, but the ones I do have give a sense that setting is in fact important to readers, but also that it can be quite coloured by their existing notions of Italy. For example, one review of Argus's The House in Via Manno, one of these books set in Cagliari, set mostly right in the centre of Cagliari, suggests that the reviewer has a vision of Italy as a place that is traditional, rustic, salutary, and, well, Tuscan. This book is like peasant food discovered by chance at the end of a rustic old laneway in a random Tuscan countryside village. Very random. So random it's inexplicably in Cagliari. Simple and honest, yet hearty and warming, delicious and memorable. So it's good for you as well, a bit like going to Italy when in mourning. There are no complicated flavours or tricky ingredients. This is from the West Australian. Another review of this book, perhaps herself channeling Cleaver Green in a way, observes that she enjoyed the book partly because of the romantic Italian setting. If it was set in downtown Dubbo, I don't think it would have had the same effect. I can only agree, though perhaps for a different set of reasons than the young women of Clio Book Club would have cited. If anyone's not from Australia, never mind. Dubbo is in country New South Wales. I wonder how we get that back. It's probably not worth it, don't worry. An online reviewer of La Gioia's... Yeah, so don't worry. Swap displays, maybe? Did I touch something? Oh, it just turned off. Oh, don't worry. I only had like one more picture. An online reviewer of La Gioia's Bringing It All Back Home says, as a non-Italian, but one who lived in Italy during this period, which was the 1980s, the appeal of the novel is as a means of seeing Italy through the eyes of an extremely expressive local. If you are non-Italian, the appeal might be to see your 1980s from a different angle, from the perspective that comes from life in Bari, Apulia. This review captures quite nicely, I think, that combination of the familiar and the fresh that is part of the reading experience for many of us. So, seeing your 1980s, but from an Italian's perspective. We bring something to our reading, but we also expect to be surprised or have it challenged. As an aside, this is perhaps why foreign crime fiction is so popular. Readers have a bit of an idea of what to expect, thanks to their familiarity with the genre, but they also get a frisson of excitement from the foreign perspective and setting. Something I haven't touched upon is what elements might be activated in translation that fit with the original context about as much as the proverbial cavoli a merenda. That is, associations likely to be marginal, if not altogether absent, for source text readers. For example, the novel I'm translating at the moment, which is this Giochi Cattivi, is set near Avio in Trentino. The presence of a sawmill, the border location close to Austria, complete with a little bit of dodgy trafficking back and forth over said border, meant that this reader, and let's not forget that a translator is first and foremost a reader, could not help but be reminded of, and here I would show you, the sawmill from Twin Peaks. Now those are really the only points that the two texts have in common. The storylines are completely different, as is the mood, even the time period. So it's pretty tenuous, but it's there for me. And it could well occur to other Anglophones if my associations with friends, if my conversations with friends are anything to go by. I'm not saying that these associations are impossible for Italian readers. Although I was too young to be allowed to watch it, I well remember visiting Italy during the winter in which the first season of Twin Peaks screened, and hearing about how the country's restaurants were empty on the night of the week the show aired. But Italian readers presumably would have a whole host of other, more powerful associations with Trentino, as depicted in the novel, meaning that Twin Peaks would be so far down the list as probably not to feature at all for most people. So this is a sort of slightly factual, slightly silly example, but it does give a snapshot of the sort of intertextual richness that translation can bring to a text. This kind of reader association is almost impossible to prove or test among the readership, so it's really more of a mind game, I suppose, than anything else, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Translation tends to happen in a private space, but afterwards the text goes out into the world. Where it goes and what is made of it, what reader preconceptions, stereotypes and desires will add to the mix, can be difficult to predict. But part of a translator's job is attempting to predict and preempt that. I try to use reflective practice, of which today's talk was just a little snapshot, to get insights into this process of shifting a text across language zones. Being a teacher of a foreign language and culture, I am obviously an advocate for the value of moving outside one's culture of origin, and in fact that's a journey that any literary translator has, at a very personal autobiographical level, been on themselves. Translators and other cultural mediators, including scholars of foreign cultures and literatures, like most of us, have a kind of deformazione professionale that means it's easy for us to see only value in exposing more readers to worlds with which they might be unfamiliar. Surely reading translations is mind-opening. A window on the world leads to greater tolerance and intercultural understanding, maybe even world peace, etc., etc. However, some scholars in translation studies have warned against too rose-coloured a vision of translation and its payoffs, suggesting that very often translations are consumed to serve the purposes and needs of the target audience on that audience's own terms, in order to appropriate a text's foreign qualities for the enrichment of the target culture, as Catherine Batchelor has put it. This can even lead ultimately to a kind of redomestication, as foreign texts, particularly foreign takes on familiar genres like, say, crime fiction, as pointed out by Chantal Wright, get stripped of their foreignness and sucked back into more familiar, more digestible local products. What a translator can try to do, nel suo piccolo, is to harness their audience's familiarity with the source culture, even if it is a partial, idealised or stereotyped vision of the country, and through that hope to introduce an extra degree of complexity and nuance, thus chipping away at any received wisdoms that might hitherto have gone unquestioned. Any translation, even of a book that might not be a masterpiece or in any way life-changing, can, after all, expose its readers to difference.